Hello and welcome to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary's Stay at Home Speaker Series and Happy Earth Day. Today's program is Rosalie Edge, The Tie That Binds, with Dyana Furmansky, author of the book, Rosalie Edge, Hawk of Mercy.
Hello, from Arizona.
Thanks for joining us, Dyana. We are also joined by some very special guests, the grandchildren of Hawk Mountain's founder, Rosalie Edge. We have Dr. Stephen Edge.
Hello.
And we have Dr. Deborah Edge.
Hello.
The Edge family continues to be highly active with Hawk Mountain, and both Stephen and Deborah serve on our board of directors. My name is Jamie Dawson, and joining me is my colleague from Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, Mary Therese Grob.
Happy Earth Day, everyone. Thanks for being here.
We are so glad that you are joining us here today to celebrate Earth Day. Hawk Mountain is the world's very first refuge for birds of prey, and we continue to work hard to be leaders in raptor conservation, science, and education, locally and globally around the world. Hawk Mountain is a private nonprofit, and membership is the lifeblood of our organization. To all of our members, thank you so much for your continued support. We could not do what we do without you. If you're joining us today and you're not a member, we hope that you consider becoming one in the future. Hawk Mountain hopes that everyone remains safe and healthy during this time of COVID crisis, and we are so excited to offer our community a variety of free virtual programming. As always, Hawk Mountain greatly appreciates any donations. Just so everyone is aware, today's program is being recorded. The video will then be accessible on Hawk Mountain's YouTube channel. We also have a link on our website directly connecting you to our YouTube channel. At any time throughout today's program, viewers may submit questions through the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform. We've designated time at the end of the program to take some questions from the audience. And we are so excited that Dyana, Stephen, and Deborah are joining us today to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day and also to honor our heroic founder, Rosalie Edge. At Hawk Mountain, we like to think of every day as Earth Day, and certainly Rosalie believed that conservation advocacy was everyone's responsibility. And before we go further, I'd like to share a photograph of Rosalie.
And if you would like to learn more about this very inspirational woman, we do have two publications, Hawk of Mercy, the book written by Dyana, and Rosalie Edge, A Most Determined Woman, which is a brief biography that was written by her son, Peter Edge, and these are available in the Hawk Mountain bookstore, online store on our website. And I would like to mention tonight's program is just a live presentation. So if you're used to seeing a slideshow or PowerPoint, you will not see that this evening. So Dyana is just giving her time to us, and we're very appreciative of that.
Thank you, MT. Stephen, can you share with us a memory highlighting what it means to be a member of the Edge family conservation legacy?
Well, I think of a number of things when I think about my grandmother, but I think some of the most important, when I was probably 7 or 8 years old, I went to a board meeting, and they were held at Schambach's at the time, of course, and there was Roger Tory Peterson and all the other luminaries that were on the board at the time. But I think what it brings to me, and I was thinking about this just a few minutes ago, is that it helps me understand the power that a single person can have when they're a most determined woman to affect change, to harness that power of an individual, to bring other people of like mind and spirit, to all coalesce around a common goal and to actually make a difference in the world. I think it's a lesson for all of us, a lesson for our children. And to me, that's one of the great things that I remember about my grandmother, is that she as an individual took upon it herself to organize and make these great changes in the world that have affected us for 2 generations now, will affect us for generations to come.
Wonderful. Stephen, thank you so much for sharing that. And now Deborah is going to share some more background information about Dyana.
Okay, hi. Well, Dyana Furmansky and I go back quite a ways. I don't quite exactly remember when I met her, but I think it was when we were on an Edge family reunion at a dude ranch in Colorado with our young girls in 1992. What I do remember is that my father, Peter Edge, was talking about her with great excitement in around 1990, shortly after he had met her. Finally, he had met someone whom he felt could truly write a biography of his mother, Rosalie Edge, someone who had the right intellect and skills to do an excellent job, and someone with whom he felt he could share details about her life that he had not shared with anybody else, ever. There was never any doubt in Dad's mind that Dyana was the right person, and he was so very correct. Dad did not live to read Hawk of Mercy, but he knew that it was going to get finished and that it would provide his mother with a legacy that she deserved. Dyana spent close to 20 years researching and writing Hawk of Mercy. She had first learned of Rosalie Edge in 1990 when a friend suggested that she explore Mrs. Edge's collection of papers located in the nearby Denver Public Library. These papers caught her full interest, and she went on to collect materials, visit Peter Edge extensively, and make multiple trips to Hawk Mountain. In 2009, it was published to great acclaim. It has become a classic about conservation history. In 2009, it received the Wormslow Foundation Nature Award, and in 2010, it received the Colorado Book of the Year Award. It's well-written, engaging biography, and it tells a fascinating story as well. I am not sure how much she let Dad's admonition to follow Rosalie's motto of, quote, never let the truth spoil a good story, unquote, influence her writing. I actually rather think that she stuck to the truth. As in this case, the truth is quite a good story on its own. Dyana has written extensively on various conservation and environmental topics. She co-authored These American Lands, Parks, Wilderness, and Public Lands. Her articles on nature and the environment have appeared in the New York Times, American Heritage, Audubon, High Country News, Sierra Wilderness, and many other publications over the years. I believe that we are going to be treated now to some insights from Dyana about Hawk Mountain and Rosalie Edge across the years and how she influenced conservation, research, and education at Hawk Mountain in its early days. And I can't wait to hear what she has to say. So I am now going to introduce to you Dyana Furmansky. Let's give her a very warm, very virtual Hawk Mountain welcome.
Oh yes, I can hear it all the way here. Thank you so much, Deborah and Stephen and Jamie for putting this together, and MT. It's great to see old friends and to know that there are new ones out there in the ether. I had had plan for a group with the Fish and Wildlife Service right when the pandemic was breaking open that would talk about Rosalie Edge's role, not only as one of the major conservationists of the 20th century, and I can review for those of you out there who may not be quite as familiar as the Hawk Mountaineers, but she was, from 1929 to 1962, the foremost conservationist in the United States. And she was a militant, she was an activist, she took on the corruption that had been part of the conservation movement after John Muir's death. And she was a person who would lead Rachel Carson to find evidence of DDT's destruction based on data collected at Hawk Mountain. She also was very involved in the creation of Kings Canyon National Park, of course, Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. She was involved in Olympic National Parks creation, and her breadth was enormous. And she was the person people went to learn about conservation in the middle of the 20th century. That's been the main part of the story, and why she would have done that is what my book is about. However, I'd like to segue into the portion that is worth talking about this year. because not only is it the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which was proclaimed just a mere 8 years after Rosalie Edge died. It seems so short a time now that we've come 50 years into the Earth Day era. But she died in 1962. And the thing that I think is also important is that as 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving all women in the United States the right to vote. I'd like to quote John Muir. He wrote, "When one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the whole world." And I think that Rosalie Edge's connection to suffrage and then subsequently to conservation is not accidental, it's not coincidental, it matters. That two of the 20th century's greatest socially progressive movements are actually connected through Rosalie Edge. So let's veer away a little from the conservation work and focus more on suffrage, because without Rosalie Edge's training in the suffrage movement, she would not have had the gumption, the practice perhaps, to start another movement in conservation. So what did suffrage mean to her? Well, before the suffrage movement, before her entry into the suffrage movement in around 1915, she was living in New York. She had just come back from years abroad. She was a wealthy dilettante. She was a woman who could afford to have her children, Peter and his sister Margaret, raised by nannies. And she had nothing to do. Suffrage was beginning to brew in New York City as well as around the rest of the world. New York was a state that had yet to pass in the state the right for women to vote. It had been passed in other states, mostly out west. And Rosalie Edge had an experience on the return ship from Europe in around 1913. She was pregnant, and therefore she probably wasn't getting out much. She had to stay in one place because she was a woman who certainly respected the rules of her time period. She wasn't swanning about, pregnant. She was probably sitting on the deck with her lap covered, one might think. And she was talking to the mother of a radical suffragette from England, Lady Rhonda. And Lady Rhonda was telling Rosalie Edge about what her daughter was up to in England. In England, the suffrage battle was really, really vicious, much more violent than it was in the United States. The United States had its violence. There were hunger strikes, but in London, in England, it was really a terrible thing to go through, and women did die of starvation. And one of those who was really at the top, at the head of this battle was Lady Rhonda's daughter, Margaret. And Margaret was a hellion. And she would go to jail, and she was burning mailboxes, and she was protesting in all kinds of ways. And her mother was worried about her, obviously. In fact, the reason that Margaret wasn't with them on this cruise, or not cruise, but passage on the Mauretania, was that she was in jail. And her mother was worried about her. Rosalie Edge is hearing this for the first time. She's been in Asia. She's not aware of what's going on in suffrage. She is lost in many ways. It's a different kind of a period for her. She tries to make her way as a New York socialite, coming home and starting a family. And she is quite affected by what this woman, Lady Rhonda, tells her is going on in England. And she decides that when she gets back to New York, and after she has her first baby, and after she gets settled and everything else, she wants to join the suffrage movement. She's in her late 30s. And well, you know how new parenthood is. She has a baby, she gets sidetracked, she ends up not jumping into the suffrage movement the way she had planned. But when she's pregnant a second time in 1915, it's ramping up. The suffrage movement is the thing that's going on domestically in the country. It is a very big movement, not unlike the civil rights movement of the 60s. It affects everything, and it's a very important time. And Rosalie Edge, in my opinion, based on her writings, realizes, oh my goodness, I didn't do what I said I was going to do. So she's pregnant again, and she can't go anywhere. She gives birth to her daughter, Margaret. In the last days of her pregnancy with Margaret in 1915, she reads that Margaret Mackworth, the suffragist, who was the daughter of her friend on board the Mauritania 2 years before, was actually on, at that very moment in May, when Rosalie's daughter was being born, was on the ship called the Lusitania. The Lusitania was torpedoed by Germany during the outbreak, during World War I, even though the United States had not entered the war. The Lusitania sank not far from off the coast of Ireland, I believe. And one of the survivors of that ship was Margaret Mackworth. She was pulled out of the water. She barely survived. She was one who made it, and who went on to become a very, very prominent person, even became I think a lord in the House of Lords, one of the first women to do that. But the experience of, I can imagine only, that here's Rosalie Edge, who's made this promise to join this movement. She's on the ship with Margaret's mother. She discovers that Margaret is almost killed in this Lusitania sinking, and she's just barely risen from the childbirth bed. Well, for whatever reason, there's several reasons, but one of the things she does is she names her daughter Margaret. Now, there are other reasons she might have done that, but I'm going to focus on the Margaret connection, because it happened when she gave birth at the time that Margaret Mackworth, famous suffragette, was pulled from the Atlantic and saved. And the way Rosalie Edge says it in her unpublished memoir is probably somewhat of a hyperbole, but she said, I got up out of my bed, and I went and I introduced myself, and I immediately started up with the suffrage movement. She could not delay it any longer. She saw the price of delay. So she joins the Empire State suffrage movement, which is one of the biggest in the country. Carrie Chapman Catt has been brought in to lead the New York effort because it was considered so important. And Rosalie Edge, remember, her two children are home with nannies. They each had their own nanny. Her husband is a prominent stockbroker. She's got time, and she's got energy, and she's got fire. And she becomes eventually one of the leaders of the New York State Women's Suffrage Party, secretary treasurer, which means that she is working with Carrie Chapman Catt quite closely, and other famous suffragists. But before she rises to that position, she has a penchant for writing. She's written a lot of letters home from their years in Asia. And she begins writing. And one of the things that I was fortunate that Peter Edge gave me was a packet of suffrage pamphlets, many of which he believed were written by Rosalie Edge, since she was a member of the publicity committee of the New York Suffrage Party. And I pulled out a couple of them to show. And I have to tell you, they are kind of crumbling. But here's one. I just want to show you. These are her first writings. What woman suffrage stands for. Now, you don't have to read it. I'm just showing you the kind of pamphlets that she wrote. And this one is New York State Women's Suffrage Party, which was the organization that she was with. And it's dated September 1917. So she's getting right in there as a writer and a publicist for the movement. And she's going out there and she is standing on soapboxes and she's handing out her brochures. And as she said, she's learning how to stand up at meeting. I thought that phrase was kind of quaint, but it is the one that she does use. And here's one, First Aid to Patriotism, Women Suffrage. So these are all, she has dozens of these pamphlets. I'll just show a few. Suffrage is a war measure. One of the things that, I hope that's okay, just to get an idea, one of the things that the suffrage movement benefited by was the leaders' decision to back President Woodrow Wilson in granting them or in backing their right to the vote if they in turn would support the American war effort. And that was a big debate in the suffrage movement. They didn't want to get into it. War's not their thing. You know, they shouldn't have to make deals like that. They're owed this. But eventually Carrie Chapman Catt and her committee decided, okay, yeah, we'll go all out and back Woodrow Wilson and get us into the war. So at that point, suffrage, a lot of the writings were about suffrage as a war measure. And the suffragists went all out. They were very, very pro-war, the Great War. And they did it because they felt that they would benefit in the long run because they would be owed the right to vote. And I just want to read a little bit from this that Rosalie Edge wrote. Suffrage is a war measure. Since the war began, women's suffrage has been sweeping over the civilized world. Women are now voters in Canada, in Russia, Norway, Finland, and Denmark. They are about to become voters in Great Britain. All constitutional liabilities have been removed from them in Holland and France and Italy. The women of New York State have no less patriotism, courage, or ability than the women of England, Russia, or Canada. They asked the men of New York to recognize this and vote for women's suffrage on election day, which was November 1917. Well, they didn't make it. And it had to come up for a vote several more times, believe it or not. And finally, in the election of November 1919, it passed, which meant that I think it's 2/3 of the states had to ratify this amendment. And it wasn't until August of 1920 that enough states had ratified the 19th Amendment. I want to mention though, when it says 2/3, that means that a lot of states did not ratify the 19th Amendment until a long time later. The last state to do that was the state of Mississippi, I think in like 1964. So, of course, women could vote in Mississippi, but that's an interesting view of how reluctant people were to recognize the right to vote and other rights as well. So Rosalie Edge was active in the suffrage movement. I have to note that the pamphlets that I have from her go up to 1917. And I'm thinking that perhaps that was because she was promoted. She did leave the publications arena and she did become a board member of the New York State suffrage movement. So I'm thinking maybe that's when that happened. She put in about 2 years of penning this stuff and taking it out and sharing it. So I'm thinking that maybe that was the break, that's the time of why I have documents from 1917. And I just want to tie in one more thing, since we're talking about the ties that bind things together. I was looking to see if there was any relation to the Spanish flu, which is going on at the same time as World War I and this monumental suffrage movement to get the vote for women. There's also, right against, right out there in your face, is the Spanish flu, which we are now appreciating much more than we ever did. And so I looked in the suffrage material that she has. And there is well, there's a lot of mention of women going into factories to do men's jobs and of women taking care of things that men were not there to do. Rosalie Edge never, in what I have, in the material that I have, never mentions the role of nurses and women. And the pandemic, the Spanish flu, has affected New York in 1918, 1919. It is wreaking havoc across the country. New York is in a better position, apparently, to weather it because they have better hospitals. They have a very robust public health system, which other states don't have. So the death toll in New York is a rather low, for the day, 30,000 people die in New York. And Rosalie Edge is obviously aware of all this, but I have to say that I don't come across any mention of it in her papers. And I believe one reason is it affected the less wealthy more than the well-to-do. So she was in a kind of isolation from it, and it doesn't seem to have threatened her or her family, at least directly, but obviously it was something that she lived through and was very aware of it. And suffrage marches might have been curtailed. But the role of nurses in suffrage, all in the pandemic, was also very important in winning women the right to vote. And I want to say something again about this role of women. One theory that I am wondering about is, are women, one of the reasons the Spanish flu is not mentioned is it's World War I, there's censorship. So that was why it was perhaps not covered the way we would think it would be. However, I will posit another reason, and that is that the flu, the Spanish flu, left doctors helpless and hopeless. There was nothing a doctor could do. There was no medication. There was no, of course, there was no vaccine. Of course, they didn't even know what a virus looked like in 1918. So the doctors were really in a bad way. There was nothing they could do. And it was left to thousands of nurses to come in and provide palliative care. And they were the people there to just hold hands, to take care at the very end of life. And I think that we, again, don't appreciate those roles that women did play at that time. So that's my aside. That's part of the backdrop of Rosalie Edge in her life. But she's aware of it, obviously. She's living through it. But she's also, by the time the vote is passed, 1919, she's also, and the flu is kind of dying down, shall we say. 675,000 people die from it across the country, more than in World War I. But she has turned her interests away from suffrage at the very end of the battle. She sees it through. She is campaigning. She is working very hard. She's one of many to work very hard. And then she stops. In fact, she kind of quits the women's movement because it still exists after suffrage. It starts with the League of Women Voters is the precedent, the antecedent to the New York Women's Suffrage Party. But Rosalie Edge is not interested anymore in women's issues. I don't know why, but she has things going on in her personal life which make her take refuge, in watching birds. And she goes to Central Park to watch them. She notices them at the family property in Rye on the shore. And suddenly she is paying so much attention to birds that she's showing up late for the women's meetings that she's still going to. And it sounds like she's reluctant to go to them. And she's being reprimanded for showing up late. And when she explains, well, you know, I saw this blue heron and I couldn't tear myself away, the women who are once suffragists and now the League of Women Voters leadership with people like Eleanor Roosevelt involved, you know, they're looking at her like, you're what? What's this about birds? But in fact, she becomes very interested in birds, and she's a quick study, and she's very thorough, and she's very smart, and she learns a lot. She goes to Central Park, she studies birds, she keeps a bird count starting in around 1920-ish. I think Hawk Mountain has her bird count books, so I'm not sure what year, but it's around right after suffrage. That's when she begins counting birds. So you get the 19th Amendment, and she's off counting birds. And that's the way it is. Her son, Peter Edge, called this her fallow time because she wasn't all wrapped up in suffrage, and she was increasingly happy to spend time looking at birds. And that is just an avocation. That is nothing she's going to do anything with until 1929. Her timing, again, is impeccable. You know, she enters suffrage around the time of the Lusitania sinking in 1915. She does her thing. And then in 1929, she gets quite aggravated about something she reads about the mass sanctioned murder or killing of hawks and eagles in particular in Alaska. Something like 20,000 or 70,000, I think, eventually, eagles have been slaughtered for bounty. And the major Audubon Society and other organizations that reputed to protect nature don't seem to care. They don't care. It's not a bird that has a value. It's a bird that has a bad personality. It takes chickens. It does things that people don't like, including people in the Audubon Society who care about birds. So Rosalie Edge thinks about what she can do to stop this killing. And it's killing that no one has any problem with, at least not the official bird world. It just wasn't a bird that they cared about as much as, let's say, protecting game birds like pheasants. But she is not going to let it go. She is going to do something. And in October 1929, turns out to be the day that the stock market crashes. That's incidental. She goes to a meeting of the National Audubon Society, and it's a meeting of only men. There might have been one woman who was on the board, but it's obviously an insider group. They all know each other. There's nothing, unusual. They don't expect any trouble. And this woman sails in to their midst at the room at the Museum of Natural History in New York, Central Park, and she raises a question, which leaves them dumbfounded. And the question is, Audubon Society, what are you going to do to end the slaughter of all these eagles? Well, the meeting is shocked, and and she said that she stood up and she said that people were quite amazed at her boldness, and she could tell that they were not used to this sort of thing. She was used to it because she had come out of the suffrage movement and had learned how to be militant and how, as she said, to stand up at meeting and say your piece and stand your ground. And the president of the Audubon Society was so miffed by this. He tried to shut her down. He tried not to listen to her, but he said, let's cut this out. I don't want to hear anymore. Lunch is getting cold. So the board meeting ends. She doesn't stay for lunch, she mentions, but she goes home and she begins to foment rebellion. And she finds people who have felt the same way she did, but they couldn't speak up because they had jobs to lose. It was just not a good thing to do. But she said, I will stand in front of you. I will be the person. I've got nothing to lose. And she meant that personally because of something that was going on in her personal life, which I hope you will discover from my book. But she had the power and she had the experience to waken the very sleepy conservation movement that was purely an old boys club that had no time for women, and certainly no time for women who had no background in birds and who were trying to stir things up. She stirred things up to the point with her small coterie of followers, and who educated her further about saying, yeah, you're right, this is a problem. And they agreed, and they had been writing about it, and some of them were going to be fired if they continued to write about it. But she said, okay, you write this stuff or teach me, and I will put out pamphlets that I know how to do. You know, that's something I'm familiar with. And that's what she did. And she put out dozens of pamphlets over the next 30 years. They were considered the must reading of conservation. She started the Emergency Conservation Committee, which was based in a little office in New York. And she brought in thousands of people to support her and to wake up the conservation community, first of all, to their duty to protect all species. She never met a species that she didn't think was worth saving. And as a result of her efforts, we are fortunate enough to get Hawk Mountain, 1935, 38, 35. I think it was 1934. That was one of the major things that she did. And it was a struggle. It was a horrific struggle. She hired someone who would actually have to stand up to people who had guns, who came to Hawk Mountain every fall to shoot as many birds as they could during the fall migration along the Kittatinny Ridge of that portion of the Appalachian Mountains. But she said, no, we've got to stop this. And with a loan from a friend for $500 during the Depression, she bought the land that Hawk Mountain is now on. And she became and remained the bitter enemy of the Audubon leadership for many, many years. And one thing that I would remember also is that in reading the accounts of her at the Denver Public Library from the board of Audubon and other reputable conservationists, they would dismiss her as a suffragist. Why would we pay attention to her? She's a mere suffragist. She's a troublemaker, and we don't want anything to do with her kind. And that was an insult, not to her, but they certainly intended it to be that way. So she stirred things up. She stayed with conservation as a leader for the next 30 years. There are many, many things that she is responsible for. And if she hadn't started Hawk Mountain when she did, there would not have been the data for Rachel Carson to back up her theories about the problems with DDT when it came to the decline in raptor migrations in the fall. So that information was essential. Rosalie Edge stayed a conservationist. She would refer to the women's rights movement, but she didn't, for some reason, she was all in on conservation, and she backed off from the fight for women's rights that is ongoing. And it's not clear to me why, but in the material that I was so lucky to receive from her son, Peter Edge, most of the things in there's letters that she wrote as a young woman from Asia. There's lots of material, lots of letters from the family, lots of things about her conservation work, which went on for 32 years or so without a break. But the thing that has always touched me and that I find so relevant today in the year 2020 was this. It was the banner that she wore during, let's see, how was it? This was, if you can see this, Women's Suffrage Party. And this is what the yellow and white were the colors of the suffrage party. And this is what she wore when she marched down the streets of New York with thousands of other women leading up to the getting the right to vote. And to me, the fact that she saved this among many cherished letters, things that meant a lot to her. Many of her papers went to the Denver Public Library. I'm sure that many were disposed of, but this was something that she kept all her life, and she kept it close. Maybe this is shorter, you can see this one. It's on kind of a grosgrain fabric. So she kept these close to the other things that she cared about. And I call these the ties that bind, because they bound her to the suffrage movement, and then they gave her the energy, the guts, it doesn't matter what I do, I've got to make this happen, that she carried into the conservation movement until the day she died in 1962, which at the age of 85, was not long after Rachel Carson's seminal Silent Spring was published. And that was the book that Rosalie Edge's work led up to. So one woman passes and another woman rises to a very high point of being acknowledged. Meanwhile, as we know, Rosalie Edge's legacy had to be rediscovered. As great as it was in her lifetime, it was put aside, forgotten, and I am so glad that I had the opportunity to resuscitate her and make her, give her the important standing that she deserves, even today and into the future. And I think I can take questions. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me on this day of pandemic to talk about all of these things that are linked together. Let's see. Okay, I have a few questions here. Is this in the way?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Should I type the answer, or I will just speak the answers?
I'll read the questions for you.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. Okay, so, and by the way, Diana, what a moving presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you
so very much.
Thank you.
Was there a person?
Can you hear me?
Wait, I missed it.
Can you hear me, Diana?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yes.
Was there a person who was an inspiration to Rosalie Edge? Someone she admired?
Well, she admired Carrie Chapman Catt a lot. The one of the great leaders of the suffrage movement, and she admired a lot of the people who were suffragists. Lady Rhonda from England, Mary Hayward was another name that I'm recalling, and some of these names are not well known to us, but the people that she referred to were suffragists. Later, there were people that she admired who were in conservation, but I think that she was more judgmental of the fellows that she worked with in conservation, but she could not have accomplished what she did without their support.
Thank you. So we had two people actually ask the same question. How did Peter's papers end up in Colorado?
Well, Rosalie Edge was winding down her office in 1962. She was perhaps having problems with her health, minor problems, and she was deciding to close her office that was in New York. And she wanted to just shut down the Emergency Conservation Committee. At that point, she had been superseded by Sierra Club, Audubon Society came back in a big way, Wilderness Society. There are many organizations now in 1962, when she had been the only game in town, really, for activism in 1929. So she's 85 and she decides to close her office, and she writes to the Denver Public Library. Oh, actually, the Denver Public Library writes to her and says, we understand that you're retiring and that you might have some conservation papers on your, from your work in this field for the last 30 years. And we're starting a conservation library. And we would love it if your papers could be one of the cornerstones of this library. Well, the Library of Conservation at the Denver Public Library was the first of its kind. And she had been asked by women's colleges to have her papers there, but she didn't want that. She had a thing. She didn't want to be associated with women anymore. I don't know, after all she had done. And she was very excited about this offer to have her papers go to the Denver Public Library as part of its new conservation collection. And she sends her papers off in boxes. I met the man who actually helped her pack those boxes in the fall of 1962. And they mail them off. They are received in Denver. And in the meantime, in the days when she sent the boxes to the day that they are received in Denver, she dies. And when they try to call her office to write her and say, thank you, we got your boxes, that is when the Denver Public Library learned that she had just died.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, we actually have a question for Deborah.
Uh-oh.
Someone would like you to explain your grandmother's brooch.
I guess I should. All right. Well, this is, let's see, come up closer. There you go. This is it's a Zuni piece. I don't know how well you can see it. I'll kind of move it around. That is the same brooch. This is her brooch that she wore a lot at Hawk Mountain. And you've got a picture of her with the brooch on. Why don't you show it? The picture, Jamie, that you have is the same one.
Well, it's also on my book.
Right, it's on the book?
Yeah, she always wore it, yeah.
So this is it. And I try to wear it. I wear it a lot, but I always try to wear it when I'm doing something in Hawk Mountain.
One thing about the dragonfly is that it's a very important creature to the Indians, because where there were dragonflies, you would find water.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I believe she bought this when she was out in the Southwest, when she was out with my father in
Santa Fe.
Yeah, but I'm trying to remember when she was there, in the late 20s, early 30s.
32-ish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we have, thank you, ladies. We have several other questions. Did Rachel Carson and Rosalie know each other?
No, they never met. They knew of each other. And as you can see, there are photos in my book of Rachel Carson at Hawk Mountain. It was one of Rachel Carson's favorite places to go. She didn't live that far away in those years. And so they knew of each other. And Rosalie Edge is, old. She's in her mid-80s at this point. Rachel Carson is ascendant. But in the board, so they never met, but in the board minutes from that time, the board acknowledges that they know Rachel Carson, and Rosalie Edge says something like, it comes off like, the chairwoman suggests that we invite Rachel Carson to speak at Hawk Mountain. So they were aware of each other. And Rachel Carson eclipses Rosalie Edge. I believe it's one of the reasons that we forgot about her. There was someone else a woman who could be focused on.
Thank you. Another question. Do you think if Rosalie came on scene today, she could have done as much in the given climate?
Oh, that is something a lot of people ask. And I don't think so. I think that she was a product of her time. I'm sad to say that I think activism is important, but it takes constancy and a lot of us. And she had an opportunity then because frankly, even though the conservation world was not exactly, fond of her because she was such an irascible kind of a person, the federal government was definitely being influenced to favor conservation because of the Dust Bowl depression. So we had someone in the White House, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who loved nature, who loved trees. His Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, these people were ardent conservationists in their own. And she worked as the grassroots. She was the grassroots that we hear so much about, but she was able to get their attention because they were aligned with her. Imagine if we had people in government who were very solidly aware and wanting to do something about climate change. They would need a grassroots effort to push them to do it. It can't be top down. So she provided the bottom up to give the top of our government you see, the people want this. We're getting, everybody wants this. Everybody wants Olympic National Park. Everybody wants this. Everybody wants to save birds. So she provided that excuse, that impetus for the federal leadership to act. And I don't think we would have that today. But she would be there, I feel confident, being very vociferous about climate change and the need to do something about it.
Thank you. Another question. What was the main thing that drew Rosalie Edge toward watching birds?
Well, that is, I think, maybe the best part of the story. I can only, and I form an opinion on that based on my research. So I've never spoken to Rosalie Edge. I never got the chance to ask her. But there was something terrible that happened in her marriage and in her family. And she ended up running away in the middle of the night to leave her husband, which was something you did not do in 1922. You got two little kids, and she grabs her little kids and she runs away back to their house in the city from their house on the Sound. And she is so heartbroken. She is so completely wrecked by what she discovers. And there's no cure. There's nothing. She can't confide in a friend. She doesn't know what to do. She's really at a loss. And she begins to notice birds. She just starts doing something. She just notices. And then she begins going to the park, Central Park. She wonders from her apartment in New York, gee, I wonder if there's any birds in Central Park. Maybe I'll go look. And she begins to go there and is open to another world. But it was really, I think, and she says this, it was a way to find solace for her tortured soul.
Thank you. And kind of a follow-up question about Rosalie's interest in birds is from one of our wonderful volunteers, Cheryl Foss, who is thanking all of you for being here. And she says that we're all so thankful for Rosalie. She would like to know, what was Rosalie's favorite bird?
Oh, goodness. I don't know. I mean, I can't remember. I can tell you her son's favorite bird. Peter Edge loved the hoopoe, and he had it on his license plate. But what the birds that she began to notice at first, she loved all birds, but the birds that she began to notice, what she called the nighthawk, and I'm not sure if anyone might know what she meant. and she saw shorebirds in rye. And those are the first, those other than birds in Central Park, but they weren't, she didn't talk about them as her favorite. What they were was, oh my goodness, I didn't know they existed.
Mhm.
It was more like that. And when she found out how many there were, that just made it better.
Thank you so much. We have a question for Stephen. Stephen, what would Rosalie Edge think of the sanctuary today?
Well, I think that's a complex answer to that question, actually. You know, I think she'd be very proud of the impact that it has had, not only in northeastern Pennsylvania, but around the world. You know, Hawk Mountain has always been thought of as a place where people go to and where generations of people have gone to as a child and taken their children and then their grandchildren. And it's a wonderful experience, but Hawk Mountain is so much more with its research and its education programs, literally circling the globe with conservationists who have been trained at Hawk Mountain. I think she might encourage us to be a little more activists. I think she might encourage us to have more of a policy presence than we currently do. And I was almost wanted to ask Dyana that very question, is what would she be doing now? You tangentially addressed that through how effective could she be? What would she be doing now, given the threats not only to birds of prey but to our entire climate habitat?
Well, I think that climate change would definitely be the overarching issue that she would embrace. And you know, you've got to, right now we have a lot of people doing this. What she could have added, I think that she would have been very, very militant, maybe even more so than we've been in the United States. It's a different model, you know, but there's no question that she would have been active in a climate change movement in a militant way. Although at the end of her life, she wondered if she should have been more moderate. But I'd also say, you know, getting back to the convergence. I would also say no, I agree. But getting back to the convergence of history between, you know, with suffrage and conservation, you know, you look at something like these viruses coming out of our decimated natural areas. We think of the loss of species and where they're going and how they're able to reproduce and survive. But the way we have torn into some of these wild places on the planet has definitely unleashed these killers against us. So the idea of climate change, at some point, I mean, I don't have the science for it, but at some point, I think we are going to start seeing linkage between what happens to the biome when you do the things to it that you've done.
Well, I mean, I started off this discussion by saying what I think of as one of the lessons from my grandmother was the power of an individual to harness the power of so many, and something that you discussed. And I'd like to think that perhaps she would have, had she grown up in our age, she would have harnessed that same skill to bring masses of people together with their energy to try to affect change.
I would like to think that. I guess today I'm just feeling a little subdued. But people who you know, who's like her is the young girl from Sweden, Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg. That is the new kind of Rosalie Edge. It really is. So I believe in the work that she is doing at her tender age. And imagine if someone who was in her, you know, late 50s starts doing that and gets attention. But I think that Rosalie Edge would have been a very good ally to Greta Thunberg.
Definitely. Very interesting conversation. And I'm going to squeeze in one more question. I apologize. We don't have time to answer all the questions. There's so many good questions. So the final question is for Deborah or Stephen. And people would like to know if you have any memories of your grandmother that you would like to share right now.
Well, some of them
I already
are.
mentioned going to board meetings with her, but
Yeah,
Debbie knew her better.
I never had the privilege of going to Hawk Mountain with her. So I only knew her really at home. She was very, well, she was domineering and opinionated, and she wasn't easy to get along with. And our mother did not get along with her. And she wasn't very approachable, and she was never a grandmother that got down on the floor with their grandchildren and played with them. I cannot remember ever having her play with me. I do remember that when she came to stay with us she'd usually come for a week, about twice a year, that she would get my bedroom and I would move out to another space in the house. But I would have to go in and out of the bedroom for my clothes. And I can remember her making a point of making sure that she taught me to, when I got up in the morning, to pull my bed down so that it could air out properly, which is, you know, because she grew up in the 1870s and early 1900s, and that I should put a sachet of nicely scented something in my lingerie drawer. You know, sort of things you don't think of about her. You don't think of her having some of these feminine traits of wanting to look nice. And she talked, you know, those are the kinds of things she said to me. I never had a chance to go birding with her. The children were never invited to go birding with them. Did you ever go birding with them, Stephen?
No.
Stephen? No. So, oh yeah, well, so I was 14 when she passed away, and that means, Stephen, you were 11, right? Yeah.
9 or 10. I think
You were 9, that's right.
I actually just turned 9.
Yeah. So we were still pretty young, I mean.
Well, thank you for sharing your memories. I think everyone enjoyed hearing that. And a huge thank you, Dyana. Your presentation was so moving. Thank you, Deborah, for everything you shared. And thank you, Stephen. It was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And to our wonderful audience, thank you so much for joining us on this Earth Day. If you have not read Hawk of Mercy, you have to read this book. I am telling you, it's so powerful and so moving. It's a story that needs to be shared. So thank you for joining us. Just want to briefly mention some of our upcoming programs, our virtual programs coming up soon. Next Wednesday, the 29th, we have Meet the Kestrel. On Friday, May 1st, we have Golden Eagles in your virtual classroom at 4:00 p.m. And on Sunday, May 3rd, Rachel Carson, Inspiration, Legacy, and Challenge at 2:00 p.m. So thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
We hope to see everyone again soon. Bye for now. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.